So one of the things that's going to come up is requirements traceability. And as we talk about building requirements, we have put it out there that traceability is important. But let's talk about what it means. So in a project, I'm going to write a bunch of stuff down. So I'm going to write down requirements, and from those requirements, I'm going to define an architecture. And it's important in the architecture to know, well, what requirement inspired me to build it this way? And that's going to lead to design, and the design's going to know, well, what requirements am I fulfilling, and then what parts of the architecture made me build this choice. And then the code, same sort of thing. I'm conforming this design, and it's based off this requirement. And then the tests will be like, well, I'm testing this requirement, and it points to this piece of code that I'm testing, and all these interconnections. And documenting these connections and capturing them and making them visible has certain advantages to them. So again, our architecture, design, or code have this hierarchy to them. And each of the testing cycles ties to different aspects of this. So if I change a requirement, that's going to possibly impact my architecture, probably impact my design, and certainly is going to impact my code. And so if I can go through and say, if I change this requirement, what code is impacted by this? That's a useful approach. It's a useful understanding. If I say, these are the things I've tested, which parts of the code did I test? That's also very useful. And so that traceability becomes something not every project does. Some projects, maybe you haven't heard of it. So maybe projects don't bother with it. But why do projects sometimes spend all the time double checking this stuff? We can check the coverage of tests and we can check the impacts of changes, of course. But what's the value of that? Well, the validation of coverage is often pointed to in test cases. And to the point where you're going to see examples of requirements tracing that I would say are not valid examples of requirements tracing. I do not, from my requirements, point to the test cases that the requirements cover. It'd be like having a Twitter celebrity having to add individual followers to approve that they can see their Twitter account, like you do in Facebook. You have to accept friends. That'd be too much overhead. That's ridiculous. As a requirement, I don't care who implements me. If I say my system shall always respond to the user within 10 seconds of them hitting a button, and it will finish every sentence with a period. Okay, that's the whole system. There could be thousands of lines of code that require that. I don't need to have, my requirements add a new line of code, a new line to the requirements document every time somebody implements a line of code, right? That's ridiculous. So coverage validation is something that is useful, but something I typically do as a one-off testing issue. Assessing impact is really where that value comes up. And the idea of that is I have a tool involved which links everything together. And so every time I add a new thing, I'm going to add a new test case. That test case is point to the requirements of tests. It's going to point to the design of tests. It's going to point to the architecture tests. It's going to point to the code of tests. And the tool is going to kind of make all these magic connections. And later on, when I point to traceability, so I say, well, what happens if something tweaks? Well, I have this big web of things that's going to go off and tell me that. So if I say I'm going to change this requirement and move it from, as an example, when the Affordable Care Act came out, it said that people can stay on their parents' plans until they're 26. Well, the interesting thing about that is I was in health insurance at the time. We had to go change 4 of the states that my system impacted and move it up from 18 or 21 up to 26 or whatever the rules were inside of there, depending on the state. But for the state of Wisconsin, I had to move it from the age of 28 down to 26 because they already had that requirement. They had to back it off a little bit because they wanted to conform to everything else. So that traceability helps with that, understanding the impact of requirements. And so as I kind of hinted at, traceability is something you can do by hand. That's basically what we're going to see here. You have this table. Could be done in a Word doc, could be done in an Excel spreadsheet, where every single one of my tests should be pointing to the requirement that it's testing, not the other way around. Ideally, though, we use it with a tool that will create that reverse linking. So if I, for instance, I mean, if you look at citations, if I'm an author and I write a article, if I write a book, I publish my book, and I want to know how many people are citing my work. That's in academia. That's how you get prestige, and that's how you get promoted. You say, hey, look, 1,000 people have cited my work. That's a very popular and impactful piece of research that I published. Well, I don't do that by updating my book, my article, every single time somebody cites it, but I get tools like Google Scholar or the other places that do this sort of stuff, and they tell me how many people are citing this out there. They go search the other papers and they say how many people are pointing to mine. That's the approach that way. We don't get that. We don't have a tool, so we'll have to do the manual approach. So, for instance, we might have some approach. We have, and this would be something from a design document, or possibly something in a testing document. So you can see here, I have features 1.1, 3.2, 3.3, 4.2. Well, what happened to feature 1.2? What happened to feature 3.1? What happened to feature 4.1? What happened to feature 5 altogether, and 6, 1, 2, and 3? They still exist, but I don't care about them. In my document, my design, or my test, these are the ones that I'm testing. Feature 1.1. This is the description of what that feature is, and my response and design is I shall build the system to do this, or I shall add the component to do that. Or my test is I have created test case 124 that's going to test this feature. I've created test case 127 and 128 that's going to test this feature, and so on and so forth. So the idea is I'm pointing up to my requirements. So a more detailed example of that is I have a use case add items. The description here is it adds items to a collection from the mobile app, and the response in my design in this case is a mobile Android app will be created with appropriate screens defined by the manage item GUI, the server, blah, 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 blah. The great thing here is in test cases, you don't need to be this detailed. It's hard to point to a design. A design isn't a cohesive thing. A test case is. I'm going to have test case ABC123 that's going to test adding items successfully. And I'll have ABC124, which tests adding items that don't have prices. And I have ABC125, which tests add items that have invalid dates. It's way easier to do it in testing. This is the harder example that I'm showing you here.